Thanks everybody for coming and to hear what I hope will amount to more than my kind of airing of grievances about philosophy as a way of life and a circle of scholars I was involved with over, I don't know, a few years back. I'm essentially going to kind of critique a kind of what I take to be a kind of sort of, as I say, a kind of anodyne, non-ideal theory that's coming out of philosophy as a way of life. And I'm going to kind of try to merge that with some of the insights in philosophy born of struggle, and I'm going to kind of claim that philosophy born of struggle is sort of doing it better than philosophy as a way of life is doing it. And, you know, like every workshop, right, there's promises made in the introduction that are not fulfilled in the end. I will get about 1/3 of what I promise, mostly kind of setting up the context of philosophy as a way of life as non-ideal theory, a little bit of remarks on philosophy born of struggle, and then some kind of promises about kind of integrating some concepts from Deleuze, like the war machine and the apparatus of capture, as a kind of sort of demonstration of how sort of counter-revolutionary thought has been kind of captured, I should say. Yeah. Okay, so introduction. Recent work in philosophy as a way of life, or what I will call phi-life, purports to reinvigorate the discipline by reconnecting it with its practical origins in paradigm traditions such as Buddhism, Stoicism, ancient skepticism, Taoism, Confucianism, or even existentialism. These traditions are characterized as less concerned with the kinds of subtle conceptual refinement and hyper-specialized research agendas which dominate contemporary academic philosophy than with concrete practicalities surrounding the general problem of what makes for wise living. Highlighting philosophy's role in theorizing non-ideal problematics concerning the art of living, the love of wisdom, or philosophy's presence in everyday life, following Pierre Hadot and John Cooper, phi-life argues that philosophy is an activity of orienting one's life, less a career than a calling of vastly deeper significance than its overly theoretical and thus impractical public image might suggest. In what follows, I offer a socio-political critique of phi-life, arguing that it unwittingly becomes a Trojan horse for the intellectual capture of philosophy's revolutionary potentialities. Drawing on resources from the work of Leonard Harris's Philosophy Born of Struggle and Lee McBride's Pragmatism for the Oppressed, as well as Gilles Deleuze's concept of the war machine and the apparatus of capture, my argument critically investigates how the present image of phi-life inadvertently neutralizes philosophy's capacity for radical social and political transformation. I first rehearsed phi-life's critique of John Cooper's claim that phi-life traditions advocate for a life oriented by reason alone. By contrast, Pierre Hadot, as well as more recent thinkers such as Stephen Grimm, Caleb Coho, Nick Bomarito, Stephen Engel, Karen Storr, Jennifer Cassetti-Ferenczi, Simone Kotva, Matthew Sharp, Michael Ire, and there's more, call for a more pluralistic phi-life, which includes phenomenological, existential, and spiritual religious elements. I challenge these authors' wholesale neglect of more earthbound and ongoing moral catastrophes, such as economic exploitation, class struggle, and racialized capitalist oppression. Second, in order to redress this lacuna left by Cooper's critics, I turn to Harris and McBride, who offer a more materially urgent and direct line to philosophy's advocacy and empowerment of the dispossessed. Phi-life, I argue, can and should be articulated and marshaled as a philosophy born of struggle, equipped with theoretical resources and practical resolutions for combating systematic oppression and strategic marginalization. Lastly, which I won't do, because I won't have time to get to it, right? Or it's underdeveloped. I turn to Deleuze and Guattari's concepts of the war machine, the apparatus of capture, as important pragmatics for such a marshalling of non-ideal theorizing of phi-life born of struggle. These concepts bring into relief how historical patterns of institutionally captured resistance potentialities work. My analysis concludes that phi-life, properly understood as born of struggle, whose activity consists in the creation of novel resistance concepts in response to ever-evolving apparatuses of institutional capture, thus serves as a revolutionary's corrective to the establishment shepherding of philosophy into capitalist compatible and thereby socially and politically anodyne theory production and forms of praxis. So the first section, philosophy as a way of life as anodyne non-ideal theory, and this will be kind of the bulk of the talk. Phi-life purports to concretize philosophy, to make it relevant for everyday life, to put the ought back in thought. In short, to demonstrate the discipline's true nature as accordingly that of the production of wisdom. Professionalization and specialization notwithstanding, Phi Life maintains that a life can be lived in a way that is distinctively philosophical, as distinct, yet potentially compatible with ways of life defined by received value systems and traditions, such as Christianity or Buddhism, various indigeneities, secular liberalism, atheism, libertarianism, hedonism, etc. Philosophers Stephen Grimm and Caleb Coho argue for a way of for a way of life to count as suitably philosophical, it must meet three jointly necessary criteria. Namely, first, a commitment to a value-prescribing worldview. Two, a structuring of one's life around that worldview. And three, this is kind of the most interesting one, a worldview-aligned engagement in what they call truth-directed practices, where the latter refers to a practice's truth-conduciveness on the condition that its worldview happens to correspond with reality. And I think it might be a kind of correspondence theory of truth kind of lurking in the background here that might be problematic. It's something that I realized as I was editing it last night. So if Buddhism is true, for instance, meditation would help you appreciate emptiness, liberation from desire, and the transitory nature of the self. If Christianity were true, on the condition that such a God exists, praying would be a plausible way of connecting with God, etc. While our faculty of reason has an important role to play in truth-directed practices, most Phi Life authors acknowledge that reason is not the exclusive road to truth and reality. Consider, for instance, profound experiences of beauty. This approach serves as a foil to John Cooper, who draws the lesson from ancient Western philosophers that living one's life philosophically means living in strict accordance with reason. Contemporary Phi Life thus recuperates, or to say a pun intended there, I guess, the original Phi Life approach of Pierre Hadot, who draws from religious, existential, and phenomenological sources, as well as Henri Bergson, who would go on to exert a subsequent profound influence on later French thinkers, notably Michel Foucault. So the first kind of subsection here, Phi Life and the image of thought, was going to kind of bring some Deleuze into this. One of the first signs that contemporary philosophy, or contemporary Phi Life, is mostly a white bourgeois affair is that it takes the notion that philosophy is about the cultivation of wise living as somehow newsworthy. That is, as something revelatory, a novel avenue of teaching and research in our contemporary context that needs renewal and revitalization, right? As it likely would seem to those habituated only to professional philosophy's standard operating procedure. Right? However, thinkers from more minor traditions would likely find a more terrestrial description of philosophy's vocation entirely obvious, right? Especially those in the vein of classical pragmatism or personalism. For example, John Dewey, Elaine Locke, Martin Luther King Jr., Cornel West, right? Pillar to their educations, right? For example, Kwame Ture, Huey Newton, Malcolm X, or Angela Davis. So perhaps it would be more accurate to say that in our contemporary academic milieu, Phi Life is not so much in need of a revitalization as it needs what would actually amount to a proper demarginalization, right? Indeed, the cloistered intellectual habits of one's parochial academic territories condition one's appreciation for what is actually intellectually novel. As Deleuze reminds us in Chapter 3 of Difference and Repetition, philosophy should involve analysis and critique of not only objective presuppositions, such as argument premises or under-verified data or empirical conditions uncontrolled for, but more deeply those sedimented and habitually operative subjective presuppositions, which, while escaping our conscious awareness, nevertheless shape an image of what thinking ought to be. There does, in fact, seem to be a peculiar image of thought present in Phi Life that alienates it from material concerns of urgent socio-political import. Consider, for instance, Hadot's various flowery depictions of the way of life approach to philosophizing, as variably, quote, the soul's serenity, the simple fact of existing, the pleasure of existing, right? Pleasure derived from contemplating nature, the soul's immateriality, the transcendence of the soul with respect to the body, end quote. Or the claim that the, quote, attitude of wonder, that which appears and occurs is in the present moment, right? Implying the entire universe in a single moment, right? To see the world in a grain of sand, right? It kind of goes on and on about like this, right? All of which seem to point to some sort of mystical unity in the purity of the true self with the cosmic totality of the world. Consider, too, Hadot's claims that the effect of philosophy as a way of life provides for us to live, quote, in the present moment, end quote, quote, and another quote, letting ourselves be neither troubled by the past nor worried by the uncertainty of the future, allowing us to accede cosmic consciousness by making us attentive to the infinite value of each instant and causing us to accept each moment of existence from the viewpoint of the law of the cosmos. Also note Grimm and Coho's apparent alignment with such transcendent musings. Quote, a philosophical life includes views about humanity and our place in the cosmos, requiring seriously contemplating the cosmos, right? Even if your practical circumstances limit how often and how systematically you can do this. So what habits of thought are here deciding a view of how thought should think? What actual problems are occasioning thought's operation here? In Deleuze's terms, what is the image of thought at work in these passages? It is not my intention to begin punching up a straw man, which maybe sounds like I might be setting myself up to do. But it would be misguided, right? Simply to critique and reject phi life as an empty vessel for intellectual navel-gazing, beanbag lava-lamping, or as a palliative to petty bourgeois melancholy. To be clear, the issue is not that a more earthbound, socially conscious, or politically insurgent approach to philosophizing is somehow incompatible with phi life, but that phi life authors neglect almost completely the impolite realities of economic exploitation, class struggle, racialized capitalism, colonialism, police brutality, military interventionism, etc. Right? The infiltration and co-option of multiracial working class movements in various realities. Right? For what it's worth, problematics such as the art of living, the exercise of practical wisdom, phronesis, in these singularly aphoretic situations, and other such encounters are decidedly and irreducibly non-ideal, right? Not least in the sense that the phi life orientation, in my own humble assessment, stems from the premise that human beings, while thinking beings possessed of rationality, ideally, and also non-ideally, are embodied creatures of habit, subject to constitutive social and political influences, for better or worse. In light of the latter, then, it is likely that the extent to which one is professionally rewarded for trafficking in assuasive abstractions and the philosophically inoffensive, right, or the opposite, from drawing attention to otherwise, right, is the extent to which the image of thought will predictably reflect the values of the purely ideal. Particularly instructive on this point is the work of Charles Mills, who famously argued that ideal theory is not merely abstract in the pejorative sense, but positively obfuscatory, which is a wonderful word. The guy had a vocabulary like a mountain, right? And hence ideological, right? Obfuscatory and hence ideological. And then it promotes and standardizes a model of theory proper, which perpetuates illicit group privilege. The impolite realities of racism, exploitation, and so forth are seen as contingent deviations from the universal normative ideal, and not, in point of fact, as the intentional outcomes of deliberative social structuring professionally managed by a hyper-credentialed, petite bourgeois sub-elite. While phi life may have something similar going on with its particular brand of anodyne non-ideal theory, in my estimation, however, contemporary phi life points to a further issue, perhaps even more philosophically vexing than the by now familiar phenomenon of ideological or perceptual blockages. Indeed, a truth still uglier. Namely, that it is not only ideology or a failure to see that conditions its image of thought, it is also a matter of economic power. I'd wager, in fact, that the true provenance of phi life's whitewashed trappings lies in what Karl Marx described in the first volume of Capital as the mute compulsion of capitalism. And here's why I think this, right? So consider how little prodding it would take for phi life thinkers to acknowledge that traditions such as Marxism, socialism, anti-racism, anarchism, and other forms of anti-capitalist or leftist dissidence are value-prescribing worldviews in their own right, capable of structuring individuals' lives and guiding truth-directed practices, and are thus congruent with the criteria suggested by Grimm and Coho above. Such an apparent relation of fit, right, in the face of phi life's wholesale neglect of real-world moral atrocity, then must be explicable not as a subjectively conditioning ideology or false consciousness or related perceptual failure to recognize the other. Rather, as I suspect, the explanation is to be found in objective structures of economic power exercised by the system of incentivized interest under capitalism, which does not reward dissident intellectual practices but their opposite, and thereby, wittingly or not, compels subjects interested in academic careers and entrance to the middle class to downplay, ignore, or otherwise neutralize less anodyne and establishment incompatible theorizing. Here, Phi-Life's innocuous image of thought, its common sense, its good sense, right, as Deleuze would have it, is less a function of Aristotelian akrasia, or weakness of will, than that of a realist's visceral imperative to material security, compelled by the mute forces of power policing our habits. As Nietzsche reminds us, the particularities of one's embodied existence and metabolic relation to the physical world play a decisive role in one's habits of thought. In this case, habits determined by late-stage capitalism's peculiar distribution of material resources. Here, the human animal's biological imperative to maintain a steady access to life's necessities has us all playing a game of codes and decodings and recodings in a world of manufactured scarcity and a generalized, systematically driven precarity. And here's a nod to Anti-Oedipus's kind of colorful description of desiring production. Everyone, after all, needs to eat, to drink, a place to sleep, and a place to fuck. Subsection 2. This is on the kind of habits of the professional managerial kind of professoriate, so I'll just kind of read like maybe one paragraph of that and maybe kind of summarize the rest. What am I doing on time? Okay. Seen in this light, Phi-Life merges seamlessly with leftist sociological descriptions and critiques of the so-called professional managerial class, or the so-called PMC, right? Such as those found in the work of Barbara and John Ehrenreich, and more recently in Catherine Liu. PMC society, so construed, finds itself nestled between the higher and the lower economic orders of social stratification, functioning like a buffer, but one which simultaneously provides the bourgeois establishment with a crucial overseer class. The PMC professionalizes and credentializes itself as a prolegomenon for managing and thereby also kind of economically siphoning, right, the vital energies of the lower strata. Various labors previously carried out informally by members of the now managed group are appropriated and adeptly fashioned into a bureaucracy of salaried functionaries, for example, in education, healthcare, mental health, logistics, etc., replete with opportunities for advancement and often conflicting sets of values and incentives and associated careerism. Right? And the working classes also notice how they kind of cover for each other. They kind of cover the wagons. They sort of defend each other when there's dissent. Right? So I'm going to kind of skip the rest of this section. But if you kind of, at least in my estimation, a lot of the kind of Phi-Life stuff just appears as this kind of correlate for like the academic correlate of like the self-help industry, right? Which is itself kind of a PMC version of the former informal labors of ordinary emotional support or life advice or grief counseling, etc. Right? But I'm reminded of a quote from Socrates from the Apology, right? And it's everyone likes to kind of quote the unexamined life thing in the Apology, right? Unexamined life is not worth living, right? But my favorite quote in that is where he says, and I quote, he says, quote, "Where wisdom is concerned, those who had the best reputation were practically the most efficient," right? So I'm kind of thinking like these, philosophical professionals, right, and the kind of managerial elites, right? He's kind of critiquing that and attacking that, right? And he says, wherein men who were thought to be their inferiors were much better off. Okay, last sort of little bit of this, I'm going to get a little bit into philosophy born of struggle, and then maybe just kind of summarize the rest. Section 2, philosophy born of struggle as revolutionary non-ideal theory. Right? PMC critique thus lays bare the socio-economic foundations of Phi-Life's white flight away from theory's urban ghettos to the cozier gated communities of suburban pure practical reason. This is from Charles Mills, a great paper called Through a Glass Whitely, right? One is reminded of the class of white liberal moderates so fervently admonished by Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, quote, "the great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom, as described by the latter, according to whom justice shall arrive naturally and in due time, though not quite yet, and only with the necessary patience to let the formal procedures play out. So there's going to be kind of a little bit of a critique of the kind of democratic formalism process that I think is sort of baked into into pragmatism, right? Which Leonard and McBride make quite a bit of. Contrast this with the revolutionary's insurrectionist ethos and its vehement skepticism of the studious and instrumental rationality of process-focused incrementalism. Right? Indeed, the latter seems unable or unwilling to explain the growing presence of revolutionary attitudes in contexts of ongoing moral catastrophes as anything other than impatience or frustration with the necessarily slow-moving gears of deliberative democracy. Right? Here, as they say, Leonard Harris's philosophy born of struggle has entered the chat. Right? He writes, a philosophy, and this is what everyone's quoting, it's like the third time we've heard this quote, I think, over this conference, right? A philosophy that offers moral intuitions, reasoning strategies, motivations, and examples of just moral actions, but falls short of requiring that we have a moral duty to support or engage in slave insurrections is defective. Moreover, a philosophy that does not make advocacy, that is, representing, defending, or promoting morally just causes, a seminal meritorious feature of moral agency is defective. Right? So where in pragmatism or mainstream philosophy or even phi life, right, are the conceptual and practical resources that would yield the necessary, quote, advocacy and authoritarian voices that demand the liberation of the enslaved? This is from Leonard. Patience, humility, kindness, tolerance, reasonableness, fairness, prudence, and other commonly refrained virtues so congruent with the pragmatic ethos of respectability seem absurdly ill-equipped as normative guidelines for when the issue is that of systemic and ongoing moral catastrophe. Right? Especially vexing is the fact that trust the process, right, is so often weaponized by beneficiaries of the morally problematic status quo. For example, white liberals, capitalists, bureaucrats, right, as a respectability tactic for placating dissent. One points this out, right, only at the risk of not being a team player, right? Yet what if your team, right, what good is being a team player if what your team is engaged in is bullshit, right? So I use that in a kind of Frankfurtian sense, right? Not interested in truth, but in appearances, right, in self-interest. Right? Lee McBride's pragmatism, and this is one sentence towards Lee, for Lee, right? Lee McBride's pragmatism for the oppressed responds to and develops Harris's insurrectionist challenge by drawing out elements of pragmatism that support a revolutionary ethos, right? And so the rest of it is kind of underdeveloped, right? So I'm essentially arguing Phibos does it better than Phi Life, that these kind of spiritual exercises, right, is a big part of kind of philosophy as a way of life, especially in the kind of Hadot vein of it, right? So prayer, meditations, journaling, Walden ponding, right, are for the latter more about kind of interpreting the world or coping with the world rather than trying to change the world, right? Or someone like Angela Davis would claim, I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change, right? It was a kind of stoic sounding, right? I'm not doing that, right? I'm changing the things I cannot accept, right? Which seems to me a kind of sublation of stoicism, right? A kind of rejection of it as quietism, right? So Phibos is also more useful for understanding philosophy born of struggle, for rendering intelligible practices of resistance which seek to practically improve the world rather than merely interpret it, right, beyond the mere academic discussion, there's a kind of interesting, I don't know if anyone's familiar, when in 2008 they declassified what came to be known as the CIA Simple Sabotage Field Manual, right, which goes into how the CIA and the FBI would kind of infiltrate these sort of left-wing resistance groups, right? And they would recommend strategies like they would recommend strategies that you sort of experience in committee meetings, right? Like bring up things that are not, relevant, right? And kind of misfile things and, raise objections, encourage being reasonable and moderate, right? It was a kind of way of like weaponizing the procedural kind of discussion, right? In a way that will kind of confound, right, actual action, right? And I think that kind of merges interestingly with sort of Deleuze's sort of anti-discussion piece that he has in What is Philosophy, right? Where he kind of makes a kind of stab at Richard Rorty's sort of bourgeois kind of pragmatism, right? A sort of polite conversations, right? Philosophy takes place in these kind of polite conversations. Or someone like John Dewey, right, a member of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, right? Does everybody know what the Congress for Cultural Freedom was? In 1966, it was revealed to be a kind of CIA front for kind of anti-communist sort of penetration into academia, right? And so I kind of wanted to tie some of that stuff with the idea of like the war machine, right? And kind of was a little bit confused about kind of the difference between like, is this a war machine that the state is appropriating, right? Or is this an apparatus of capture that they're trying to capture dissent, right? Let's see. As Deleuze describes, the philosophers are the first ones to run away when discussion is suggested, right? Philosophers create concepts which lend sense to unconscious mechanisms of power, compelling us for better or worse. Right? So I don't know. I'm just kind of trailing off into my notes. But one of the questions I was interested in, and I think Brent kind of helped me kind of clarify how the sort of flow of it goes, right? Is here the relationship of the state to capitalism, since the latter seems to operate a dual coding and decoding of flows, which the state then serves as the kind of enforcement arm, right? The sort of police as the sort of enforcer of the state as a sort of enforcer of contracts model, right? Or the police as defenders of the bourgeoisie, right? There's also the question I have kind of about the state's appropriation of a war machine, which is not entirely clear to me, although at least not the time I wrote these notes, it's a little bit clearer to me now. But I will, I guess, stop there in the interest of getting questions going. Yes?
For your presentation, this was really interesting. I have questions about this. So I think one of your examples about value system or Buddhist. My question is, what if your goals of the so like in Buddhist perspective, they try to like reach a number. Now it's like kind of like understanding about like emptiness about the self. It sounds like it might be a really good way to understand what decoding of the flower and capitalism. Oh, I'm just like wondering, but you put the like Buddhism in the value system. I thought there might be other way to think about the Buddhist perspective.
No, I think. Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm kind of, when I mention Buddhism, I'm kind of mentioning it in this kind of, in the way that a lot of the phi-lifers are talking about Buddhism, right? The question of whether or not there's like revolutionary potentials in Buddhism, right, I think is totally a legitimate question, and I'd be super interested to, explore that. I don't think you're ever going to get it out of the phi-life folk. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
One of your point was that so you really focusing on how could we decoding our flower and the captures, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, but your point about the Buddhism was that so through the meditation they can reveal about emptiness, right? So I thought there might be like some connection to understand about the Buddhist perspective, how could Buddhist like perspective can achieve like decoding of the capitalism. So can you explain a little bit more? What was your intention?
I don't know enough about Buddhism, I don't think. Like, at least me, that can answer that. There's probably someone here that does. If maybe they want to jump in.
I guess it kind of feels like that is being
Get him in to put this.
Yeah. So could you? I'm really hard of hearing. So could you speak up and reformulate your question?
So my question was that let's suppose our goal is decoding the flower and capitalism, and his discrimination of Buddhism is that through the like meditation they can achieve about the emptiness and understanding and individual emptiness. That it sounds like there might be like other way to understand Buddhist perspective to achieve the decoding the floor and capitalism. I want to little bit hard more about what is your thoughts and is there anything you want to like suggest?
Right. So, and I want to stress that like I'm not an expert on Buddhism. I was raised Buddhist and I studied Nagarjuna, but I'm not going to claim that I know all of the traditions, all of the different canons. So if someone who's an expert on like Theravada or like Tibetan Buddhism says I'm wrong, they're probably right from the perspective of their tradition. But I think, so there's a lot of elements to this, right? Like when you're talking about like the way Phi Life describes Buddhism, that's a lot of what Western engagement with Buddhism historically has been about, because when Westerners first, and by Westerners I mean Europeans, when they first engaged with Buddhism, it was right after the Enlightenment, and a lot of people were disillusioned with Christianity. So they directly engaged with the East, searching for a religion that they could make a scientific religion, right? They wanted to find a religion that would support like Enlightenment ideals, Enlightenment values. And they thought they discovered this in Buddhism. When they finally reached India, Buddhism had actually died out in India. Buddhism was very successful, like spreading to the rest of Asia, but in India, it didn't thrive. Like Indians even joke that Buddhism is their most successful export. And so when they get to India, right, they find all of these Buddhist temples, but like Buddhism not like thriving as a religion there. So what do? They decide that it's their job to like revitalize Buddhism, to like reinterpret and like respread the gospel of this scientific religion. And so they create a version of Buddhism that is a scientific Buddha that values that, and then that is like a lot of, even now today, what Neo-Buddhism like is about. They piecemeal it apart, right? They say like, oh, like here's all the benefits of like doing meditation, but you don't have to believe in like the cycle of reincarnation, or you don't have to believe in the cycle of suffering, that you can like pick and choose what you want out of Buddhism, whereas a lot of traditional Buddhists would view that as being, insanely damaging to the tradition, and like that you can't actually do that for all these sorts of reasons. But to go back to your point on like what Buddhism can bring, I guess, to the table with regards to engaging with like praxis, like a lot of people have this idea that Buddhism is just about like meditation or like personal self-help because of like this Western view of Buddhism that has come about historically. But if you look at a lot of what a lot of Buddhist organizations are doing in Asia, right, like Tzu, like for example, like they are actively, like they're putting out like hundreds, well maybe not hundreds, but like tens of millions of dollars of like charity work into building schools, building hospitals, creating infrastructure to help lift people out of poverty. They're doing a lot of disaster relief, because for Buddhism, the idea is that like you cannot like try to attain enlightenment until all of your basic needs are met. And so the whole point is that like we get people to a point where they don't have to worry about if they're going to have food on the table, if their kids are going to be able to go to school, like if they're going to be able to get access to like medicine, healthcare, whatever. And then once people are like at that stage in life, then we can maybe like, begin to have a discussion about like, nirvana, enlightenment, the Buddhist teachings and all that. But until all that is met, there's no point. Like you're not speaking the same language, because they're wondering if they're going to have food on the table. So like Buddhism has like a lot of these different methods to try to deal with the more like material conditions of reality, but like in the West it isn't viewed that way because of the way Buddhism kind of has been engaged with by like Westerners. I don't know if that helps.
We probably just have time for like one question.
So I teach an early modern philosophy class. We talked about it last night. And I do think that you're correct, going back to probably the fight of the sophists and philosophers in Athens, and the way we methodologically trace the history of Western philosophy. The philosophers claim to have a logos. Or both, they acknowledge that sophists have a logos, but we have a logos that's oriented to truth. But I think that you can think in terms, I teach a course about freedom, and I think that you can see in people's actions, right, an implicit philosophy of freedom, of what they meant, what freedom meant to them, because what they're willing to risk, what they're willing to fight for. It isn't necessarily spelled out in the type of logos that ends up in arguments. So I'm reminded what C.L.R. James says about the Venetian revolutionaries, the revolutionaries of Saint-Domingue. They didn't need to read about the rights of man to know what freedom meant to them. You could read it off their actions. So I wonder if that's not a way to think about philosophy of life from people's, like, it's kind of what the business folks or economics folks call revealed preferences. It's whatever you say that you're after, I'm just going to go with you to the supermarket and see what you buy. And that's actually going to show what you think. So I wonder if that means, if that gets to something you'd like to respond to, if there's an implicit philosophy that you can read off of people's actions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's probably. I want to say that's like the philosophy proper, right? What people, don't believe what people say, right? See what they do, right? Then you'll know what they actually believe. You know what their values are. So yeah, I mean, I think that's completely. I mean, and I think that might even fit with like the anodyne version of philosophy as a way of life, right? But insofar as we're making it about like eating granola and going to Walden Pond and sort of having this kind of self-help ethos, right? This is what the kind of thing that I maybe I don't know, spell it out clearly enough or whatever, but it is something very, very neoliberal about that kind of, that's just sort of like, it sort of trains you to sort of accept kind of things, right? And it reminded when Alan was just talking about how like corporations will appropriate like Buddhism into like the Zen office, right? Where the goal is to make you a productive worker, right? It's not to get you to. So yeah, I mean, I think that's totally fitting, and I'm like, I appreciate the C.L.R. James. I mean, can you repeat what the concept or I can't remember what the concept of that you had brought up.
Well, I use the term inaction.
Okay.
You enact a philosophy of freedom. You grab it off of people's actions. And
Yeah.
Sort of see what they value based on what they do, and that tied in with revealed preferences.
Yeah.
Which is economics.
Yeah, and I was just we didn't need to read books to know what freedom was. Yeah.
Well, that's paraphrasing. He says
Yeah.
something like slaves in Saint-Domingue do not need to wait for.
Yeah.
Well, because that's the whole thesis of the book. They radicalized the French.
Right. Sure.
Well, really nice discussion. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
So do we want to